So one thing that I want to dive into a little bit, and then I think we can open up as well, because I would love to hear everyone's views on this question. So specifically the issue of talent, right? When you look at other industries, I agree that there are people who are attracted by news and who sort of fall into our industry through various crooked roads, but they're still relatively rare. One of the so I was talking today to one of the sort of AI solution providers around analytics, and they say the biggest challenge that they run into is that they come to a newsroom, even a big newsroom, even a tech savvy-ish newsroom, and they have nobody to talk to because there's no data analysts, there's no sort of people who are able to sort of talk the language, and other industries are poaching people from Facebook, from Google, from a multitude of startups. We can kind of, convince a couple to come over. How do we solve this talent gap? And yeah.
I think that the talent gap is part of a much wider problem. I think that in the past, well, in fact, it's got worse over the last 20 years. Journalism used to be a much more open career path, and then it became something you had to be a graduate, and then it became somebody you had to be from Oxbridge and done PPE to qualify. You had to live in London and be able to do internships. It actually got worse. So I think it's actually part of a bigger problem. Journalism desperately needs more people who are scientists, more people who are lawyers, more people who are from diverse ethnic or other backgrounds, so that journalism can, reflect the diversity of society and reflect the diversity of the news agenda in the real world. So I think in that sense, having people who understand technology is just kind of part of a much bigger problem that journalism has had by being too insular. I do think that this is partly about, as I said, collaboration. It's not necessarily that you, as a news organization, will have all that talent and all that knowledge and skills. I mean, most industries don't. That's why we're seeing, for example, universities like Cambridge and Imperial, Stanford, and so on, being so important for so many industries and providing so many startup people. It's about time that journalists or journalism, especially the managers, became less kind of insular, less protective about their culture, and started trying to learn lessons from those other industries, but also to partner much more, commercially. I'm not talking about some sort of lovely charity. And of course, some people are trying to make this happen. This is absolutely what my project at the LSE is about. So I do think that it's a two-way street. You're quite right.
If I could just come in, Jacob, because another hat that I've got, of course, is attached to the University of Central Lancashire, which is, one of the oldest journalism schools in the country. And one of the biggest problems we've got is you think that newsrooms move slowly sometimes. Well, believe me, the kind of the university sector is just absolutely horrendous. And we are talking about any minor change even now not coming in for kind of 2 academic years ahead, and that tortoise level movement in skills training. And only just recently this week, conversations about whether or not students should still be doing shorthand or not, and whether or not accreditation bodies. I mean, I don't want to go too far away from this, but if the skills gap, it really does need hammering home the urgency with which training institutes have got to start looking more broadly about skill sets and opportunities and jobs if they're going to survive. And that's not a UK-based problem. That is definitely a Europe-based problem.
Definitely agree. If I can go further down this rabbit hole, and then I promise, because it's a pet peeve of mine, we can widen out the discussion. And by the way, any questions, please do write them in the chat. At least in my experience, I feel like journalism has a big silo problem. And Ben and Shane, having worked in various publishers, but not as a journalist, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. you know, one of the things that I found, not in all newsrooms, but especially in amongst unhappy media, is that there tends to be a lot of animosity between the editorial side and then the rest who are not doing their job properly. You know, is that something that you've run into, or have I sort of stumbled amongst onto
well, I have worked in a
particularly unhappy places?
I have worked in a number of media organisations, and I think, yeah, there was always, like, I was a bit more on the commercial side, and we did work well with editorial, but, you know, even back then there was a, you know, ads are ruining the publication sort of mentality. So I think that could be true to a certain extent. I mean, I think some of this hiring, you know, the talent sort of question, you know, it happens with small startups as well. We've had talent poached by banks. You know, you get 6 months into a contract with someone, and, you know, you're working, you know, on the project, and, you know, a bank comes in and offers them a huge amount more money than, you know, that we can afford. So everyone, I think, has those challenges. But I think, you know, if you go back to the point of, you know, silos, I think, yeah, collaboration, you have to have the right mindset. The journalists and the technology companies, you know, or your internal teams need to work together to solve these problems, and they need to keep them practical. You know, that's the point. There's no point coming from really a technical point of view. Oh, this great new algorithm has been released, unless it can be applied to a practical solution to drive value into the business. So I think there needs to be more of that. And also, you know, try and do deals, you know, or partnerships with academic backgrounds. We work with the Aston University, you know, Innovate UK, support through knowledge transfer partnerships, collaborations, you know. So that's sort of, you know, initiatives we've looked at quite a lot in the past as well.
Just to chip in, I'm the queen of chipping in. Do you know, a really important aspect of this as well, you know, is about this interplay between, you talk about silos, but there's, you know, there is this silo between the startups and the mainstream media, and I don't care, you know, it is absolutely true. So how that happens, of course, we've got, you know, the theories of open innovation and how that has to happen, but a lot of newsrooms still are so entrenched in their way of doing things and making sure that their kind of value return is really rich, that people like Ben, myself, and others, when you actually get to that beta phase and you need to just, you know, have those partnerships that involve trialing, it's really hard. And there's a mapping question there, which we've come across before, Jacob, I know we have, but actually, because there's no real mapping of ecosystems now, because so many small news organizations have got to a certain level, and that whole middle section of the news ecosystem isn't effectively mapped. And it's a real barrier to entry for startups who are developing AI technology, because they can't actually find people who would try it out and work with them. So then you end up having to try and find, you know, the digital editor of the BBC and get 5 minutes with them, which is just kind of like, hello, that's really, really hard. So the silos that happen at that dimension as well.
I think one of the problems is that one of the virtues of media, news media traditionally, has been its independence. You know, news organizations said, we are the Guardian. We create this fantastic journalism. We don't want anybody telling us what to do. The news desk is the most important part of this organization. I remember that when I was a journalist as well. We never heard from the marketing people. We never knew what our audience was thinking. In a way, that's a great thing. That is how you create great journalism brands. But the world has changed and moved on so much. And so I think there's almost like a need for translators. There's like a need for kind of ambassadors between the news organizations and everybody else. I mean, it's what I describe what I do in a way is what you do, Claire, you know, trying to sort of map the system and try and see the relationships beyond the newsrooms. And obviously they are working under enormous pressure. The nature of news is literally deadlines day by day, and they find it intrinsically difficult to think strategically. You know, they just don't have that. They're usually promoted journalists who become managers. So they are so wedded to that day-to-day culture that it's very difficult for them to listen to people who aren't journalists, let alone think about developing relationships with them. I think it's changing. You know, I think it's changing. I think you're seeing organizations becoming much more flexible. Go look at the job titles of the recruitment being done everywhere, from the Telegraph. You know, the Telegraph has now got a chief exec or wherever he is, who was from the tech sector, you know, right across to the Guardian. They are much more aware that they've got to restructure themselves, but inevitably it takes time. And as you know, Claire and Ben, you know, that there is a cost to collaboration. There's a cost to innovation. You have to build that into your strategic planning, and often people just aren't prepared to do that, and they will lose out.
This is really an interesting trend of the new job titles that are coming up, and I think it is really encouraging to see, you know, on Twitter regularly these mentions that, you know, journalism is not just, you know, typing stories, it's a team effort. You know, there is this diversity, which I think is really great. And I promise to stop. I feel like I've become the moderator who's supposed to ask question, but is really giving more of a comment on everything. But you know, I think there's something really great there, because really one of the biggest assets that media have is the brand. Everyone knows it, and being a familiar name carries a huge amount of weight. And I think it can be, you know, for the people who do leave Google, which, by the way, is also not a great place in terms of salary compared to other places, because they attract people for the brand, right? So they can allow themselves to pay a little bit sub market versus other tech players. And, you know, you have people who move to media, they know the brand, they want to join the Guardian or even smaller publications, and they come in with this passion. And I think the fact that newsrooms are becoming more accommodating of them, of having them basically join the team, is something that's very encouraging. Moving on from the talent issue, you know, a couple of years ago, there was this idea that, look, AI is something that media need to be developing in-house. I think, you know, the Bloombergs, the BBCs, the Finnish public broadcaster, you know, these big players were doing a lot of development themselves. Is that still going to be likely to be the main driver? Or are we now entering the period where it's various sort of third-party solution providers who are going to drive this? What are your thoughts? Ben, I imagine that you have an opinion about the power of sort of, you know, these external solution providers, but please, how do you see this?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I think, look, from our learnings, and obviously we're trying to assist journalists in the industry by driving efficiencies. I mean, we have very much adopted third-party technologies. You know, we are a Google Cloud for Startup partner, which is great, which gives you access to some of their, you know, their technology stack. I think, you know, would take so much time you know, to develop a lot of this technology internally, trying to be as quick as you can, you know, develop prototypes, use third-party technology in the right way, and make sure it's in the ethical way. Is the route we've taken, because otherwise you just need so much resource. It would be huge to be able to actually tackle some of these yourself. So yeah, we've taken that approach. I mean, there, you know, not just, you know, you have to work with Google. I mean, there's some other great, you know, NLP, you know, libraries and platforms out there which are free, like Spacey, etc., which can, you know, get you in, you know, testing and using some of this technology for very, very low costs. You don't have to do everything yourself. Again, you know, we do come from you know, very much from a usability point of view as well. So we focus a lot on, you know, maybe a product that's very easy to use, but there's quite a lot of complex technology in the back end. But I would try and, you know, embrace it as much as possible, but make sure you're wary and do it in the ethical way. Yeah, because otherwise I just think the cost will be just too much.
Absolutely, right. And I think there's also a data issue, right? Like, individual publishers might just not have enough of it, especially if you look at a very specific cut.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. You
Yeah.
could spend months, years training algorithms. Which if someone's done it something within in the space that you're working within, it can fast track you considerably.
A question from Robert, which I think builds up on this quite nicely. So maybe Ben, you can start, and then would love to hear everyone else's opinion as well. How would you pitch the need for a media manager to partner with other players, startups, AI hubs, other industries? How do you sort of get that across to the people who have been very focused on the journalism, but maybe not on the bigger picture sometimes?
So within the publishing organization, have someone that sort of bridges the gap between the organization and, say, technology providers.
I guess yes. And by the way, if I'm butchering the questions, please feel free to to reprimand me in the comments section. But my understanding is, how would you? What is sort of the argument that you put forward? But I think your point around having a translator, is that sort of how you go about it?
I think you need to have someone that obviously understands, the engineering side to a certain extent and can bridge that gap, understand, the needs from the journalist. I mean, you do that by speaking to them and testing with them and, getting their feedback, because again, there's no point leading with the technology and say, look, this new algorithm has come out which can automatically generate articles for you, if that's something the journalists don't want. So feed it back to the practicality side of it. I think it is a very good idea to have someone bridging that gap, definitely. It's interesting you talk about that sort of role. I mean, there's editorial productivity directors is a new role, I believe, is within publishing houses, which looks at all of this, editorial workflows. It used to be, obviously heads of content are important roles, focusing on search, and content, quality, but this whole production and efficiency role seems to be coming into play. So that seems to be happening within organizations. But I would say you do need someone who can understand, to a certain extent, the engineering as well as the editorial needs from the journalist and the user. It would be very beneficial, yes.
I think I'd concur about the head of product. These sorts of questions I would think would sit perhaps within that kind of role. Where I see the gap, and maybe I am an inherent sense maker in that way, but for me, it's about a management team being able to have industry insights that comprehensively set out what are the opportunities in simple ways, kind of what this can do for you. Then they can reasonably coherently set out a vision and a realistic roadmap for how that translates into their organization. And then knowing, because there's a whole compendium or database of startups delivering go to these guys if you want this, go to these guys if you want that, I can navigate that kind of, I can take myself through that journey. It's just about making sure that that journey's connected, so that there's the industry insights, there's the sense making internally in terms of vision and applying that, and then there's the, do I know who to go to buy this in, or make that decision in a transparent way? So that's kind of the workflow. And we I guess all who are really passionate about these emerging innovations in our industry need to make sure that there are not too many gaps along that process.
Just jumping up, I'd even go a step back and say that the first thing that the media manager or the media executive has to think about is, what is the problem that they're trying to solve, or what is the goal that they're trying to arrive at? It's not a question of looking at technology, it looks bright and shiny, it looks fabulous, could it work some miracle? You've got to start from assessing properly, exactly what you're trying to achieve. And again, with the project that we worked on with these news teams, where they were working with different, startups and research people and so on, part of the experience, but part of the best bit of the experience for them, they told us, was actually talking to other news people about that process. So sharing experiences and sharing kind of lessons with other journalists and with other news organisations, which is generally speaking what never happens unless it's sometimes in the pub or at a conference, is really valued, because it's a fantastic way to catch up. If you can talk to your peers about best practice, if you can talk to your peers about whether loyal AI is any good or not, then that's going to give you really, that's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of energy. So I think it's partly about opening up and being prepared to learn much more, even before you start that process of talking to those external bodies.
Yeah, I'd just add to that. Yeah, I mean, you could take the approach of programming last. It's all about the problem you need to solve. You can create some quick prototypes these days, with InVision and, some sort of front end coding prototypes to say, oh, this did this for you as a journalist. Does that work? And then you tackle the program challenge, and that'll obviously save a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of resource.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm just sort of being wary of the time. If any other final questions want to come in, that's great. If not, we promise to keep things, short and punchy in the Zoom era. That's okay, Robert, perfect. Coming in with the last question. Are we creating a self-help algorithm for media managers? I think a lot of virtuous elements here, but anyone want to jump in on that?
What I'd say is it's I don't know if it's an algorithm, but it's definitely the idea that you just have to have some kind of strategy. And a strategy doesn't mean a roadmap that you will never deviate from. What I mean by strategy is just knowing who within your organization is responsible for these relationships and who to bring in to the conversations to make sure that things like tool adoption is done in a way that serves your needs and missions. So in that sense, it's probably a spreadsheet rather than an algorithm. But and I think it's starting to happen. I mean, it's not like media organizations aren't aware of these issues. They are. They are trying to think more like, product developers. They are trying to think more like retailers or service industries, for example. They do realize that the world is changing. It's incredibly competitive. So it's not like they're completely resistant. But as I said, it's very hard given all the other pressures that especially kind of daily news media organizations are under. But we should celebrate some successes. I think in the UK there's a tough time at the local level, but we're seeing some really interesting green shoots from hyperlocals, for example, even from the big local news chains, and we're also seeing some fantastic successes. Most of our big UK news brands are still alive. That is an achievement in themselves, and the iPaper, for example. And the Independent, which are two separate organisations now, of course, are both recruiting more journalists as we speak, because they seem to have kind of got over a revenue hump. So, it's not all bad news.
Fantastic. I think on that optimistic note, we're going to slowly bring things to an end. I think this has been one of the more encouraging discussions that I've heard on the topic, and especially when we consider the fact that, as we already mentioned, there is a lag in terms of testing and implementation. There is also a lag in terms of education. People who are now seeing that journalism is something exciting might just be going in to university, and we're going to get them to join us in 3 or 4 or 5 years, or or in 10 after they've done a PhD and gone through various postdoc appointments. So definitely lots of good things to come. Thank you so much for this really fascinating and brilliant discussion. Once again, just to remind everybody, you have the links in the Telegram, in the chat. Go and check out Value My News. That's going to be revolutionizing the UK media industry set up, especially on a local level, over the coming months and years. Do join the Loyal AI testing opportunity. Sounds really exciting. I'm going to come in and subscribe from the fix. Hope that we get picked. And do subscribe to the Journalism AI newsletter to follow everything that's happening in that area. And then, of course, as always, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the fix. Charlie, Ben, Shane, Claire, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion, and thank you to everybody for joining us today.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.
Toodle pip.
Oh, thank you.